here to be the moderator of the panel. Thank you.
Is there more light up there in the front?
They chose not to have light.
The
They wanted to be in the dark.
yeah, the speakers wanted to be in the dark.
You look better in the dark.
Yeah, they look better than that. So I was going to say, I'm Linda Berger, and I'm from UNLV, but Jean already said that. So those of us who are lawyers are endlessly fascinated by how judges and juries make decisions, because lots of times we just don't understand how they can decide things the way that they do. So it's not surprising that in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a real growth of a subspecialty in the application of what I like to call persuasion science to legal persuasion. And today we're going to have three different perspectives on that. The first one is Professor Debbie Bassett from Southwestern Law School. She's the Justice Marshall F. McComb Professor of Law at Southwestern. And she's going to talk about the subtleties of silence.
Thank you, Linda, and good morning, everybody. Many thanks to Jean Sternlight and the conference organizers, and to UNLV and UC Davis and the University of Illinois for sponsoring this really terrific conference. Silence is a really fascinating subject. We don't tend to think much about it, perhaps especially in law school and in lawyering. In the law, we tend to ignore silence, typically referring expressly to silence in only one of two contexts: the right to remain silent in criminal law, and silence as constituting assent in contract law. Instead, in both law school and in lawyering, there's a focus on words and speech. We begin that focus in law school with the Socratic method and moot court experiences, and we continue that focus into lawyering, whether interviewing, counseling, negotiating, or engaging in courtroom practice, and whether we're dealing with a client, a third party, or opposing counsel. There isn't any real focus on silence. Yet silence is a powerful tool. Silence has the ability to convey a broad range of meanings, which in turn creates the ability to cause discomfort or distress, or to relax and encourage, or to convey a sense of power and control. Although we don't always think of it in this way, silence and speech actually are not total opposites. They've been described as part of a continuum, ranging from the most prototypical instances of silence at one end of the continuum, and the most prototypical instances of speech at the other end. Pauses or hesitations within speech make it possible for each speaker to have a turn, so that there can be actual conversations rather than serial monologues. As a general matter, Americans tend to be very uncomfortable with silence, and as a result, they rush to fill any silences with speech. This general societal discomfort with silence also affects interpretations of silence. In the United States, there's a tendency to ascribe negative connotations to silence, to view silence as being indicative of weakness, avoidance, lack of preparation, or actual deception. These two tendencies, discomfort with silence and viewing silence as being negative, have particular ramifications in law school and in lawyering. Law professors tend to want quick, precise answers from their students, and lawyers often become impatient or actually suspicious when their clients or witnesses have a lot of hesitations in their speech. Historically, researchers have largely overlooked silence. Both researchers and individuals generally have tended to view silence as an absence of sound, and therefore as an absence of communication. But silence often has meaning, and researchers subsequently have begun to explore silence, finding that there are different types of silence, each of which may serve different functions, and which in turn may have many different meanings and contextual variations. In terms of types of silence, although it is acknowledged that not all types of silence carry a message, most silence research, logically, focuses on the type of silence that is called communicative silence, meaning silence that serves some communicative purpose. With respect to the functions of silence, it has been proposed that there are 5. Linkage, meaning to bond people or to separate them. Affecting, meaning to heal or to wound. Revelation, meaning to make something known or to hide something. Judgmental, meaning to assent or to dissent. And activating, meaning thoughtfulness or mental inactivity. Contextual variations include both situational differences and cultural differences. Meanings of silence can range from comfortable contentment to sulking anger. In particular, a particularly salient and significant trait of silence is its potential to reflect not just multiple meanings, but actually contradictory meanings. A few examples may help here. Silence may reflect agreement or disagreement. Silence may reflect comfort and camaraderie, or discomfort and fear. Silence may reflect respect or disrespect. Silence may reflect intense concentration, or apathy and distraction. Silence may reflect approval or disapproval. Silence may reflect politeness or rudeness. Silence may reflect an attempt to encourage or to discourage the speaker from continuing. Silence may reflect an attempt to connect or an attempt to disengage. For whatever reason, most Western cultures, and Anglo-American culture in particular, generally find silence difficult to handle. We tend to feel more comfortable when there's a fairly constant stream of sound, and our culture has developed remarkable ways of ensuring that we don't experience real silence for any length of time. We listen to the radio, watch TV, talk on our cell phones, listen to our MP3 players. Even the shopping malls and elevators often play music. This sense that sound should be continuous is carried over into conversation. Once we've started talking with someone, we seem to feel the need to keep chattering without a break until the conversation has formally ended. But psychological studies tell us that silence also serves important communicative functions. Communication involves both sending and receiving. And researchers have concluded that in receiving communication, the most common error is taking action, meaning speaking, before a reasonable amount of time for responding has passed. Four seconds. Psychological research has demonstrated that as little as 4 seconds of silence in conversation can result in discomfort and awkwardness. In one study, 86% of the participants reported feeling uncomfortable when silences occurred in their interactions with others. This discomfort with silence is what causes most people to fill that silence with speech, sometimes with truly any speech, in order to make the silence go away. Why such discomfort? In psychological studies of silence, participants repeatedly have reported feeling a pressure to talk, coupled with a fear of disapproval. Recent psychological research into silence has concluded that conversational flow provides people with feelings of belonging and social validation. Humans are particularly sensitive to social acceptance and belonging, and accordingly, even short disruptions in conversational flow can lead to a sharp rise in distress levels. Although there certainly also are comfortable silences and individual comfort level variations, silence in conversation can prompt feelings of nervousness, distress, and rejection. In conversations, silences can take the form of short pauses, long pauses, lulls in the conversation, or a complete lack of response. And our culture tends to be uncomfortable with all of them. Rushing to fill silence with speech is our societal norm, but it disserves us most of the time in our role as lawyers and as law professors. One study demonstrated that teachers tend to move very quickly through classroom interactions, typically waiting only 1 second after asking a question before expecting a student response, and also waiting only 1 second after a student's response before asking the next question. But when teachers were trained to increase their wait time to 3 seconds instead of 1 second, 3 amazing things happened. First, the length of student responses increased from a mean of 7 words to a mean of 27 words. Second, the frequency of student-initiated questions increased. And third, the instances of student failure to respond dropped. Silence creates a space, an opening, where something can happen. The something that happens might be the processing of what the person has just heard, or reflection, or to move the conversation in a different direction, or to give emphasis to what the person is about to say next. But in any event, we need time to take in what's being said and to think about how to respond. Effective listening, where we genuinely focus on the other person, can be rare in everyday life. It often seems that everyone is more interested in talking about their own ideas than in paying attention to what anyone else is saying. But interaction without any silences prohibits the processing of information. Often we are so uncomfortable with silence that we're preparing what we want to say next while the other person is still talking. And of course that means we aren't really listening. In law practice, there are times when the lawyer is expected to present a monologue, such as at the outset of presenting a motion. But particularly in interviewing, counseling, and negotiating, a lawyer monologue is counterproductive. For example, in an initial interview with a client, the lawyer has a number of goals: to form an attorney-client relationship, to determine the client's goals, to gather as much as the client knows about the facts, and to reduce the client's anxiety. Whether the lawyer is successful in achieving these goals depends in large part on her ability to make the client feel comfortable, to encourage the client to speak freely, and to remove inhibitions to communication. The capacity to respond to and use silence is essential to each of these. But because lawyers too, just like the general population, tend to be uncomfortable with silence, they tend to fill in client pauses and hesitations with their own speech. In particular, by responding to pauses and hesitations by asking additional questions, and thereby interfering with clients' abilities to present their stories fully. Filling in these silences serves, in effect, to rush clients. And by rushing clients, lawyers send the message that clients need to fill in those gaps quickly and keep things moving without pauses and hesitations. The client accordingly may perceive the lawyer as uncaring, lacking empathy, downright rude, or just plain in a hurry, without enough time really to listen to the client's predicament. Rushing the client undermines the goal of making the client feel comfortable and reduces the likelihood of building rapport. If a lawyer simply marches through a list of prepared questions and is unable to tolerate silences, the lawyer may only get part of the story and may actually end up developing erroneous hypotheses about the theories of the case. Instead, researchers have concluded that it's preferable to use nonverbal facilitators, such as nodding or leaning forward, or brief words of encouragement, such as, "That's okay, take your time." Jumping in to fill silences involves substantial risks. The risk that the lawyer thinks she understands what the client's silence is about when maybe she really doesn't. The risk that the lawyer's intervention will chill the client's communication. The risk that the lawyer's intervention will distract or otherwise channel the client's focus to a different direction. By practicing tolerance of silence until we become more comfortable with silence, by sacrificing some of our own comfort level in order to help others, and by genuinely focusing and listening to others, we facilitate better communication and enhance the potential both for building rapport and for acquiring valuable information. Thank you.
So, continuing what I like to think of as our contrarian trend this morning, Professor Ken Chestek is going to talk about negativity bias. Ken is the Assistant Director of the Center for the Study of Written Advocacy at the University of Wyoming, and he's been teaching legal research and writing for 14 years at Michigan, Indiana, and now Wyoming. Ken?
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Jean, for the wonderful opportunity to meet with like-minded people and explore what I think is an extremely important aspect of the law and law school in general. My topic is a work in progress. I know some of you are in the same boat as I am. I have done a lot of research and thinking about this, and I've got a sketch of what I want to do, but the part that's not yet done is I want to add a bit of empirical research, and that has not been done yet. So I'm not going to write the article until I have the empirical. I have a hypothesis that I've come up with that I want to test, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. First of all, the first presentation during yesterday morning, Doug Yarn asked, the first question was how many people have some psychological training, and when I saw half the hands in the room go up, just like Doug, I got scared because I don't have that kind of formal training. I'm interested and fascinated by the topic of psychology. I think it's critically important to what we do, but I'm kind of a rookie at doing this. So if I make some mistakes, I've learned some things. I'm going to change one of the slides here that I learned a new term I have to think about. I hope that I'm at least in the neighborhood for those of you who know what you're talking about. So my topic is negativity bias. And I noticed one thing that's kind of interesting. A lot of the topics that have been presented are negative, right? It's all about how to beware. If you learn psychology to know how not to continue to do harm, right? Because if you're not aware of these psychological principles, you might not recognize your own biases, or you might misinterpret things, or you might cause harm to yourself or to your students. So there's a lot of negativity going on, which is interesting. And this, ironically, is not a negative presentation. It's how to use psychology to benefit your client. If you understand the psychology of the judge, maybe you can write a better brief and persuade more effectively. So I actually have even though the title says negativity bias, this is a more positive kind of a take on psychology, because it's an opportunity to use psychology for the benefit of your client. There's my little and the reptile piece will become apparent in a second. So negativity bias is the basic topic, and the concept here is that bad is stronger than good. And the brain latches on to negative information and processes it, and it has more impact on a person across a wide range of phenomena. We process negative information much more thoroughly. It stays with us. We remember it more. We give it more weight than positive information. It's very powerful stuff. And the source for this, and again, I appreciate the opening session this morning. This is not the original research. This is a secondary article, but it is psychological research. The Baumeister article is the source for a lot of this stuff. It is a kind of survey of a lot of other studies. So this group, Professor Baumeister, and a lot of other researchers got their arms around a whole lot of original studies, looking, and they actually were looking for studies that would show, A, here's negative information that was powerful, B, here's positive information that was powerful, and they wanted to compare why one was different than the other, and they couldn't find anything that said positive was better. Everything they came up with was the negative information had more power, more strength, and they didn't like that finding, but that's the finding they came up with after studying almost 200, I think, different studies. So this is, like I said, secondary information, but I did look at some of the backup studies, and I think the conclusions are pretty sound. Bad information is retained longer than good, carries more weight. There's the Velcro reference. It's like negative information sticks in your brain, whereas the good stuff slides right on through. Right? For example, and just think about it in your daily life. Is this true? How many of you got some bad student evaluations? Do you remember those? Of course you do. I remember my, I get really good evaluations, but there's always a couple of them that say he did something wrong, he didn't, bugs the heck out of me when I get this bad. And that one hurts, right? The good stuff I forget about, but the bad ones, God, I know it really bugs me. Look at the news media. The newspapers and the TV, it's all about death, destruction, mayhem. It's all bad stuff. But that's what gets our attention. Why do politicians keep running negative ads? We hate them. Everybody says we hate them. Don't do that. They do. Why do they do that? It works, right? We retain that stuff. We all know that John Kerry was a swift boat fraud and he was not a hero, right? That's the kind of stuff that works. It sticks. Why do people not care about what the NSA is doing to us? Right? Because we're afraid of terrorism. And if NSA can stop terrorism, it's a good thing, so that's more important than having our privacy. Right? There's all kinds of ways in which negative information in our daily lives has much more power than good information. Why? And here's another one where I'm going to plead ignorance that those of you who know more about psychology than I do might think this is oversimplified, but I only have 15 minutes. The reptilian brain was the first part of our brains to evolve back in the day. Why is that? Well, that's the part that kept us alive, right? We had to have the ability to perceive danger and react immediately to danger and fight or flee. It's the fight or flight response is in the reptilian. We've heard some talk about the thinking fast and slow. This is the thinking fast part, right? When something happens, you got to react instantly, or else you're dead, right? So that's the thinking fast. That evolved first, and because it evolved first, It helps us stay alive, but it's also very deeply embedded. So when it happens, it's unconscious and it is really powerful. We get it immediately, and it's to help us survive. The next part of the brain that evolves is the limbic brain. This is the center of your brain that controls emotions and values and seeks beauty and those kinds of things. And the final part, that the neocortex, controls rational thought. That's what we call higher functions. But that's more, this is the thinking slow up here. You're considering things and rationalizing and reasoning things out. That's the more conscious part of the brain. But why did this happen? The negativity bias, the reason that the brain is so attuned to negative information is that it is adaptive. In terms of evolutionary science, it is adaptive behavior. It helps us. Bad things are dangerous, and you can die from bad things, right? So you need to be able to react to those. And so having the ability to react quickly to them is adaptive. It helps this organism survive and continue on. Therefore, we have an incentive to remember bad stuff and how to avoid bad things, but we forget the good things because if we know there's something good out there, we don't know what it is, we want to seek that out again. So to continue seeking out good things, we forget what happened in the past. We knew it was kind of good, but we don't have that experience all the time, so we want to keep seeking it out. That's also adaptive behavior. So that's why good things don't get remembered in the specifics the way bad things really do. So, and here's the one thing that the study found, that there was some light at the end. I hate the fact that negative is more powerful, but there is some, there was one thing that they found that where good information actually did have a bias. Distinguishing between moral evaluations and competence evaluations. So there's a negativity bias regarding moral traits. If somebody has behaved badly in the past, we are expecting to continue behaving badly in the future, a negativity bias. But if somebody has performed competently in the past, that we have a bias that they will continue to perform competently in the future. That's one of the studies that the Baumeister people looked at and found some one area in which positivity might actually work. In terms of lawyers, if you are if you lie to the judge, you're going to be slammed for it. If you've done good work in the past, you're going to be rewarded for that. I'm really running out of time here. So what does that do with persuasion? You might think that judges are above the fray. They're not participants in the lawsuit, so the negativity affects the parties, but not the judge. He's above it all. He's the rational neocortex of the whole process. So you would think maybe it's irrelevant for judgment, right? No. There's a couple different ways a case can be presented to the court. It could be a story of what happened between the parties, the litigants. It could be a story about the law itself. Is the law correct? Does the law need to be changed? It could be a story about the procedure. In the last two cases, the judge actually has a stake in the outcome. If the judge is writing the law, he's going to be affected. He's going to be bound by the law like everybody else. He has a stake in the law too. Also, public policy arguments. If you make a policy argument, the judge is directly involved in choosing the right policy, and therefore those might affect the judge directly as well. Even in the story of the parties. Here's where I got to change the word empathize to perspective taking, right? You invite the court to take the perspective of your client, and therefore showing the judge what negative things could happen to your client might have power on the judge as well. So negative information might be useful to the judge. You can get the court to sense what your client's problem is. You're more likely to be able to get the judge to take that perspective and use it to give the relief to your client that they need. So, there's at least 3 ways, I think, in which this information can be useful to an advocate who's presenting a case. First, addressing adverse information, trying to take on the other side's arguments, making policy arguments, and choosing themes, and the themes we want to get to quickly. So, addressing adverse information, skip through. And all this is going to be all on the web, so if you want to look at the rest of these slides that I'm skipping over, please do so. I'm not going to have time to get to them all. Professor Smith, my colleague at Wyoming, has just published an article that's coming out this year about policy arguments and how phrasing the policy argument might be important. If you phrase it in a negative way, it might catch the judge's attention, it might be more powerful. Negative information has more power. So the flood of litigation type of policy argument, if you do this, we're going to have a flood of litigation, you want to say it that way. And the negative, you phrase it as, this result would prevent a flood of information. Floods are bad, right? Rather than say, this is going to protect, this is positive, we're going to protect the resources and efficiency of the court. That's positive. Michael suggests that the negative phrasing of it is going to be more powerful to the judge. So the way you phrase an argument might have more power. And here's the one I'm most interested in, and where I'm going to have to wrap up quickly. Choosing the theme for your case. The theme is important. What is the reason why the court should want to rule in your client's favor? You need a legal theory, which is the legal reason, the law, the logos, but a good argument also pairs that with good pathos, a good policy-based, value-based reason why the court should want to rule in your client's favor. And things can be positive or negative. So the question now becomes, do you, as the advocate, do you want to choose a positive theme or a negative theme? And this is where I've stopped. I'm stuck. This is where I've stopped, essentially, because I want to say positive themes are good, but the science suggests maybe the negative theme is going to work better. And here's where I think there's an opportunity for some empirical research, which I haven't done yet, but if anybody out there has an idea, I have some ideas about how to study this by asking actual judges to read actual briefs or parts of briefs and then measure their responses to it in some fashion. Again, this is not going to be the easy thing to do. It's going to be kind of a qualitative study. But if anybody out there has some ideas about how to do this, I've got some ideas. I want to keep this around a little bit with those of you who have an interest in this area. I think there's a lot of possibilities here to study whether or not a positive theme is going to be more effective with the court or less. And I'll have to end there. I'm out of time. But anybody who wants to discuss this with me further, please see me. And I'd love to continue the conversation outside of the room here. Thank you.
So our last two speakers are going to marry cognitive science to classical rhetoric. Professor Lucy Jewell from the University of Tennessee, Professor Elizabeth Magali from Savannah Law School. Both of them teach legal writing and related courses. So Lucy's up first.
Good morning, everyone. I can't stand the podium, so I have to be away from it. So we're here to talk about categories and cognitive logic. So let's just get right into it. What is cognitive logic? It's basically the study of stimuli, persuasive stimuli in the brain, and we're looking for patterns. And hopefully with that knowledge, how the brain responds to persuasive stimuli, we can create more effective arguments. So the overarching thesis of our presentation today is that categories are so very important to how we create meaning in the world, how legal meaning is created. But a lot of the time, categories reside underneath the surface. We don't see them, we don't question them. And our thesis is that we need to teach students how to see categories, how to challenge categories, and how to manipulate them in a critical way. So we divided our presentation into two different sections. We're drawing upon Aristotle's taxonomy of logos, pathos, and ethos. And I'm going to talk about logos. So how do you use categories to construct a positive, rule-based argument? And what are the cognitive dimensions of that? So let's start with Aristotle. So Aristotle, of course, defines logos as the appeal to reason. But Aristotle also believed that you could create meaning and learn about the world, but all you had to do was categorize things. He believed in the theory of essences. So the external world is based on these essences, and through rationality, objectivity, all you needed to do was put everything in the world in the right box. You could create a syllogism using these categories and then produce new meaning about the world. So this has been referred to as the classical view of categories. The classical view of categories has deeply influenced the law as well. We see it in legal formalism, just the idea that you can have a rule, you just need to plug that fact into the rule, see if it fits the category, and voila, you have your legal conclusion. That's classical categories. The other thing about the law is that categories are infrastructural. So the Westlaw key number system is one example of that. Categories are so important to how we create meaning, but we don't really see it, like infrastructure. We don't see it until something goes wrong, or we need to look at it explicitly and challenge those categories. Okay, so how do categories work in the syllogism? So this has been referred to as container logic. Transitivity is also at work. And the idea is that you've got three boxes. And in the first box is A. If you can fit into box A, that's great. The good news is that if you're in box A, you can also fit into box B. And then we bring in a new fact, something new from the world. Socrates is walking into the room. Can he fit into that box A? Is he a man? Oh, he can. Okay, so he's in box A. That also means that he can fit into box B. And therefore we have our new conclusion, Socrates, because he's a man, he's mortal. So container logic, can you fit into the box? And then transitivity is the other concept, which is that box A and box B are equivalent. So the thing with classical categories and logos is that it's very dichotomous. And we see this in legal thought all the time. You win or you lose. You meet the element or you don't. And that's something that we have to work with as lawyers, trying to fit our facts into that box. Okay, so the thing about classical categories is that it has been heavily criticized by cognitive scientists. George Lakoff, drawing upon the work of Eleanor Roche, as well as philosopher Mark Johnson, they have all written compelling arguments, basically saying that we do not think in clean-cut categories. We do not think objectively and rationally in terms of having our mind be disconnected from our body. The process of categorization is embodied. A lot of times it's unconscious. A lot of times it is produced by social and political context. And so the whole classical view of categories does not match up with how we really think. There is a big disconnect between how we think and how we really think. categories has also been criticized in the law. The idea is that when you use categories, you abstract, you erase the context of the case. And so if you read a book like Robert Cover's Justice Accused, you see these beautiful syllogistic arguments that are perpetuating slavery. And we see categories like liberty, property rights, but we are not seeing what's outside of the box. We are not seeing that this is a violent regime. This is human bondage. So categories, classical view of categories, that's not how we really think. It can produce unequal outcomes. Why should we teach it? I think the answer comes from several different places. But the first answer has to do with a different corner of cognitive science, which is the idea that fluency, fluent text, basically leads to a more positive response with that text, more positive ratings of the author of that text. And my point here is that a clear syllogistic argument is fluent. It's easy to understand. It is kind of like you're chunking all the information. There's been studies on chunking. And that is an overall positive. Now there are some wrinkles. There's some studies showing that more complex text will trigger more analytical thinking. Students who are dealing with more complex text tend to do better on multiple choice tests. But when we're thinking about putting our argument out there, introducing it, maybe delivering oral argument, that syllogistic structure creates fluency, and that is a positive. So this is my takeaway. The syllogistic, categorical syllogism creates fluency, and that is a good thing. Number two, the syllogism legitimizes. Justice Scalia and Brian Garner, they love the syllogism, perhaps because it allows them to feel that they are deciding the case using their mind and not their gut. The other idea is that as lawyers, we are used to seeing legal information presented in this way. And so when we see it, we kind of have this reaction, oh, we can't really deny it. We cannot deny the syllogism's power. And then finally, by teaching the syllogism, by teaching categories, by teaching students how to manipulate categories, we are teaching them that the law is malleable. You have power over the way you can construct categories. And there's this great article that came out last year from Melissa Waresh, where she says that malleability in the law is one of those threshold concepts. Once students master that concept, they are crossing the portal between the layperson and the lawyer. And this is a really, really cool thing. So the next step is, how do you use categories to build emotional resonance for your client? An argument cannot live on logos alone, so that's the next step.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about pathos, and because we have limited time, I'm going to focus on just one aspect of pathos, and that is how it connects with your client and who you're representing, the characters in your story. So this would be applicable to witnesses as well. And so what we know about categories is they help us with gap filling, and it makes it easy for us to navigate this world around us when we see something that looks familiar or that we can relate back to a familiar experience. But it also leads to this issue of bias, and we heard yesterday quite a few presentations on this implicit bias that we might have, and this is also the way that prejudices can get built up. So I want to illustrate what I'm talking about with a short video clip. Some of you might be familiar with the movie The Breakfast Club. It came out in the 1980s. And spoiler alert, this is the very last scene of the movie. 5 kids in high school have Saturday detention, and they were assigned to write an essay about who they thought they were. This is their response.
We accept the fact that we had sacrificed all this time paying attention for whatever it was we did wrong. But we think you're crazy to make us right then and tell you who we are. You see us as you want to see us. In the simplest terms, the most convenient definitions. But what we found out is that each one of us is a grain, and an athlete,
and basket case, a princess,
and a criminal. Does that answer your question? Sincerely yours, Paris.
So when I approach this topic with my students, because we talk about categories a lot in legal writing to our persuasive semester, I tell them the judge is going to see your client in the simplest terms possible. The jury will see your client in the simplest terms possible. How do we create a character for our client that is more than just that simple label? And Randy Kaiser's phrase yesterday, ignore the label, when you're looking at that painting in the museum really resonated with me. I wrote it down in quotes and thought, oh, I've got to incorporate that. We are trying to teach our students to teach their readers, their audience, to look beyond the label of their client. And so we need to know where these labels come from and then what are our options. So schemas provide access to labels. They inform, so do stock stories. They inform how we have pre-existing labels and then how we might recreate in a way that's consistent with prior knowledge. The whole way we teach law school using precedent is about building categories. We build categories in torts, in contract law, in constitutional law, and we use cases to build this framework in our students' brains. And of course, personal experience. So when we're thinking about which categories are influencing the perception of our client, we have to unpack the facts of the case, and we have to predict all of the potential stories, and then consider, do we need to advance the client's story? Is the category that the client falls into naturally persuasive with the judge? Maybe we want to exploit that for its persuasive value. Or is it one that's really, really bad? And do we need to then reconstruct it? How do we deconstruct this really bad thing? Maybe your client robbed a bank. How do you deconstruct that and reconstruct it in a positive way? Maybe your client was a victim prior to that. Or is there really no hope, and do you need to create a proxy for an ideal? So do you need to use a reified idea like the Fourth Amendment, or the right to counsel, or some other ideal or policy to stand in place of your client who might not so easily fall into a persuasive category? Let me show you an example. This is a picture of Congressman Bobby Rush. Some of you might recognize him. He's dresses like this to go to the Capitol for his job as a congressman. This is how he showed up to work shortly following the killing of Trayvon Martin, and he was wearing a gray hoodie. And he was doing a very particular thing. He was challenging the existing category that had emerged following that shooting, that an African-American male wearing a gray hoodie presented a threat. And he challenged that by saying, I am an African-American male who wears a suit, I am non-threatening, and that doesn't change when I put on this hoodie. This hoodie does not define threat, and we need to start reconsidering the way we think about what a threat is, and it's not this. So he was attempting to challenge an existing category and reframe it or reconstruct it. So we know that categories become entrenched. They become a way of life, and in a lot of ways, they help us navigate everyday life. They make it easier. We would go into cognitive overload if nothing fit into a category, if we had no label to put on anything. But we also know that categories are never final. We can question them, and we can rebuild them in ways that are persuasive and advance our position, especially on behalf of our clients. Thank you.
Jean, maybe we can put the lights on now so people can see the speakers. Just for the, I don't know how either. So questions for the speakers?
Probably not. Definitely, this is for you. So I have made an attempt to pause for kind of a long time after I asked a question because my husband is actually very shy, and I know when he was in getting his MBA, he was one of those people who would respond immediately, even though he knew the answer. And my students have picked up on it and written about it in my evaluations, and they think it's sort of a weird tactic that I use to make them feel awkward when they haven't done the reading. And so they say that other professors just give up on them and move on, but it's, you know, it's Professor Newell's thing that she makes them sit there and stew. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are. Any less positive views of silence in that way? Yes, yes.
You're absolutely right that silence can end up kind of cutting both ways. So for example, just taking something, and I'll come back to what you mentioned. If you're negotiating with someone, silence can be a very powerful tool in the sense of because both lawyers are likely to be fairly uncomfortable with silence, but if you can tolerate the silence, then it's going to make the other lawyer uncomfortable. They're more likely to speak up. They may end up offering more information. So there is that kind of twist on it. In classes, though, I do what you do. I try to, in light of the study I mentioned, where you give the extra couple of seconds there, I find that I get more student volunteers that way because a number of students just aren't able to do that really quick kind of response. But if you give them just a little bit more time, they'll be able to put their hand up, they'll be able to get the volunteering credit. But I do acknowledge freely, and the research does too, that silence can cut both ways. It can be something that does serve to put the other person give them a sense of being under pressure. And yet the ones who need a little more time to frame their answer, to think about what they want to say, those students do benefit from the additional time. So the research cuts it both ways too.
Is the research in the context of when you're asking for a volunteer or when you're cold calling?
Both, both, because it works both ways. And with respect to the volunteers, that it's particularly important to give them the extra second. If you're just asking them a question on the spot, we've all been put in that situation too, where please give me just enough, don't cut me off too quickly, give me just a second to frame my answer, and then I'll be able to spit out whatever it is that I want to say. So and I think part of the reason for that is because silence is such a complicated topic because of all the inherent ambiguity in it, and I think that's why the research reflects that same kind of twist.
Just mentioned that several years ago, the ABA pages sent me to get certified as administrative Myers-Briggs type indicator. And one of the values of that instrument was that it gave an insight that people who have a preference for introverted need time to think it through, whereas the extroverts really can't think until they start talking.
Other question? Yes.
Another way to do it is just to very quickly break the class down into 2s or 3s. And the students who really don't want to talk, they work in that small group in 2-3 minutes, and you pose 2 or 3 good questions, and then all of a sudden you bring them back into a classroom. Then the groups they'll take responsibility for their answers as a group, and then you get much better class discussion that way. And frequently I can step back into the corner of the room and the discussion will continue on its own among the whole classroom.
Other questions? Yes.
I'm just wondering if, based upon what the two of you were saying, if it might be beneficial, I don't know, because students look at what we do oftentimes and think it's weird, even though there's reason behind it. But I'm wondering if you could be very transparent and just say, I understand all sorts of students in this classroom, some that need pause for reflection. And so I'm going to give those students, and I'm going to give the whole class an opportunity to have that pause. Then you kind of normalize that.
I think that's a great idea, and that would work very well, and it works very well in a client interview situation as well, because you don't know in an initial consultation your client's comfort level with silence. You don't know whether the silence is something they need in order to put their thoughts together, or whether they've rehearsed the whole thing and they just want to spit it out, and then they're going to be uncomfortable getting subsequent silences. So I think being really upfront about it and explaining what's going on and why you're using this process would be really helpful.
Just one follow-up question. You talked earlier about negativity bias, and you were talking about pathos and how to recapture it. And I wonder if you guys have talked to each other about
I never ever talk to
about how you would frame the pathos now, what you've heard from Kat. Would you do it differently?
Well, I think that Ken's work is definitely influential, but I think that it's very synergistic to use the negativity bias to think about just reconstructing the category entirely. I think there's some aspects of negativity bias that can be persuasive, like perhaps phrasing your theory of the case in a negative way. My client was victimized here. But I think there are aspects to negativity bias that can never be persuasive. For example, your client is a child molester. That, if that is who your client is labeled as, that is never going to be persuasive. You have to figure a way to get around that label. So whether it's deconstructing and reconstructing your client as a victim of a childhood rape as well, or if it is making the client a proxy for an ideal, or figuring out some other way to remove that label and replace it with something more positive. But I do think that there's some aspects of his work that would be implicated in the labeling.
If I could just jump on that, I think as a great example, if you are defending a child molester or some criminal who is very obviously guilty, obviously the other side, the prosecution's theme is going to be very negative. That's a bad person and that's going to stick. It's going to probably be very persuasive. And how do you counteract that? You don't try and paint your client as an angel when you're not. So what you do is you change the story. You tell a different story. This is a story about the process. The process by which my client was arrested and incarcerated, there's all kinds of police misconduct, and that becomes negative and you can go in the other direction. You just change the story. So, that's going to be more, and that's why criminal procedure is such an important topic, because that's what criminals tend to have to rely on, is stories of the procedure or stories of the process. So, yeah, then I'm taking another negative theme, the police are bad. And that maybe has some power.
So I understand that our time is up. Thank you all, and thanks to the speakers.